That's where we're at now, where we've got global policy based upon completely false, deliberately created science. Because once you start a lie, you either come out and say, I told a lie, or you start admitting the truth. And for bureaucrats, that's a very difficult thing to do. Thank you very much, and I agree. My first visit to Australia, and it's a great honor to be here and to help Malcolm Roberts in exposing what I consider the greatest deception in history. And I don't think that's hyperbole. There have been deceptions, but none on the scale that this has occurred, where it's affected every country, every citizen, and policies are being driven that are detrimental to progress and advance and longer life. So it's a very important issue for me. I've been studying climate for 42 years. When I got into the business, global cooling was the consensus. And I was as opposed to that as I am to the warming, because I knew, looking at the long-term record of climate, that it fluctuates and varies all the time. It's always changing, always has and always will. And I also realized that what was going on was well within natural variability. But of course, the story that was out there was this is unnatural, therefore it must be something that humans are causing. And what happened in the cooling trend was they said, oh, the temperature's going down, oh, and simple linear trend, it'll keep on cooling. But then, of course, it did, because it was natural, started to go up again in the 80s, and then the trend was upwards, and everybody got on what I call the trend wagon. The question that should come out of Tony's presentation to you is, why on earth was this manipulation going on? Because one of the things I find when I talk to audiences and explain what is happening, the question immediately is, what's the motive? What is the purpose of this adjustment of the data? And I can tell you how it came about. The whole global warming and climate thing is a subset of the environmental trend that we're in. And environment is very necessary, very good shift, paradigm shift. But certain people grabbed it and saw the political and financial opportunities in it. A group called the Club of Rome, which was formed in Rome in 1968, took the Malthus idea that the world population would outgrow the food supply, and they applied that to all resources. They said the world population would outgrow all of the resources. And they produced a study with simple computer trends called limits to growth. That, by the way, is where the words peak oil came in. Oh, we're going to reach a peak in the amount of oil, and we see how that's been completely destroyed. On the climate side of it, they wanted something that was affecting the whole globe, because they knew that they could not get every nation on Earth to agree on something. So they wanted a threat from space, if you want. The whole world is threatened by global warming. That's why global warming and climate became the vehicle of choice for their political agenda. And the key person in all of this, and in an obscure book, which is very difficult to get now, and I recommend this to you as journalists, because Elaine Dewar was an investigative journalist at the Hamilton Spectator in Canada, and she had a list of all of the environmentalists in Canada and wanted to write a book in praise of what they were doing, saving the planet, doing noble work. The more she did her research, the more she found that they were more corrupt than the people that they were attacking. That people like Elizabeth May, the head of our Green Party, and Maurice Strong in particular. Now, Maurice Strong is a name that you should all become familiar with. He died recently in China, and he was in China because he could not go back to the United States because they wanted him for involvement in the food for oil crisis in Iraq. And what Strong did was, and in the interview with Elaine Dewar, she said, well, what's the problem? And he said, the problem for the planet are the industrialized nations. It's our responsibility to get rid of them. Because they saw that it was the industrialized nation, everybody was using too many resources, but the industrialized nations were using them at an even greater rate. So we had to shut down the industrialized nations. I want you to think about how you would do that. Because one of the things that I've found that's amazing about looking at these people is not only do they have an idea, but they have ways of implementing it. Maurice Strong is one of those people. And so he in response, well, first of all, Elaine Dewar said to him, why don't you run for politics? He said, no, you can't do anything as a politician. She said, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to go to the UN where I can get all the money I want and not be accountable to anybody. He went to the UN, he set up the United Nations Environment Program, out of which came the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That panel was set up deliberately to isolate CO2 as the cause of the problem. Now, how did they do that? Well, I think you have been around long enough to know that when commissions of inquiry are set up, the politicians try to limit them by the terms of reference. I know that. I've been on lots of commissions of inquiry. With the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they were told only to look at human causes of climate change. The problem with that is you can't possibly identify any fraction that might be due to humans if you don't know what the natural variability is and what's causing it. So that was the problem. It focused, of course, it allowed them then to focus on the greenhouse gases. But they only focused on one of the greenhouse gases. They focused on CO2. Why did they focus on, or why didn't they focus on CO2, by the way, is only 4% of the greenhouse gases? How many people know that? They completely ignored 95% of the greenhouse gases, which is water vapor. And they said, oh yeah, humans produce water vapor, but it's such a small amount it doesn't affect anything. So 95% of the potential greenhouse effect is completely ignored in those IPCC reports. And so you see the problem. Once you set up a lie, and by the way Maurice Strong did it with his organizational skills, the IPCC were people appointed by the World Meteorological Organization, which is made up of every national weather agency around the world. That's why CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology are involved. It's those bureaucrats that are running the show. Strong knew that. He knew that they'd go back and tell their politicians, hey, we got to deal with this global warming issue. It's the end of the world. That's how the whole thing has come about. We're now at the point, of course, where it's falling apart.
Tim's nearly finished. There will be questions.
So, of course, they try to introduce the Kyoto Protocol to punish the developed nations for their use of fossil fuels, take the money from there to the developing nations that were suffering a great transfer of wealth. That was exposed when what the scientists were doing was the corrupt science was exposed through the leaked emails from the University of East Anglia. They then replaced the Kyoto Protocol at the Durban conference with a Green Climate Fund. That was approved recently at Paris and was ratified in the last couple of days, signed into law. That's where we're at now, where we've got global policy based upon completely false, deliberately created science. Because once you start a lie, you either come out and say, I told a lie, or you start admitting the truth. And for bureaucrats, that's a very difficult thing to do.
About the conspiracy thing, I always hear this thing of, how can you take on 5,000, 10,000, however many thousand scientists? Well, the people doing the temperature data, it's just a very small handful of people. And these other 5,000 or 10,000 scientists we hear about all the time, their work, the quality of their work depends on this very small group of people, particularly NASA, NOAA, and a few other groups, on the quality of their work. If the temperature data they're putting out is wrong, that impacts the quality of all of the climate research which derives off that. So that's why it's so terribly important that we look at this seriously. Why are they manipulating the data? Are their manipulations accurate? And how is that affecting the conclusions of this vast body of scientists?